Uh, okay. Can you see that? Okay. Is that all right?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay. Right. There's kind of a doorbell sound that keeps going off, so I might get slightly distracted. Um, so I'm going to be talking today about book reviews, obviously. But as usual for me, maybe I'm going to do it in a slightly roundabout way. Um, what I'm hoping by the end is that we have some discussion about perhaps the ethics of book reviews, the forms it could take, why we might do it, and so on. But I'm going to start with this, which is an anecdote and a kind of forewarning of what might to come. And I put this quote up by Bourdieu. Each agent has the means of acting as a judge of others and himself, but this doesn't come without problems. So I've got basically three anecdotes, which I won't comment on. I'll just leave you with that we'll come back to maybe at the end. One of them is known to some people here, and it was when I was doing my PhD, I was asked to contribute to an edited volume on distance learning and online learning, and I was kind of flattered. Um, Most of the other chapter authors were internationally known, all of that kind of thing. So the writing process was fairly arduous, and the book got published, and the book got reviewed. And in that review, there was a very, very positive review of the book, um, except my chapter was singled out as being particularly weak, and the the tone of the review was very dismissive. So the editors of the book got in touch with me to warn me about this review, and I can still feel. I remember getting it on a Friday evening, and I can still feel my face go kind of blush red with a sense of humiliation, given it was one of my first ever publications, and that um, marked me in some ways. I didn't feel I had a right response. Um, it put me off writing for quite a long period. So that was my first sort of experience of being reviewed. Not going to comment it any further, but just to this will help frame some of the things I'm going to talk about. If you fast forward a fairly long period to the recent past, um, I've been juggling ethically around a couple of things. Um, there is someone in our field, and again, I don't want to make this personal, so I'm not going to name names, um, who occasionally writes about the AP practitioner, um, and writes things that I find pretty conservative and fairly dangerous for the profession. And the ethics of thinking about this is, and I've spoken to Letitia about this in particular because we're writing a book at the moment. What do you do when you find views or perspectives out there that you find disagreeable or a challenge or a threat? Do you draw attention to them? Do you write about them? Do you counteract them? Do you ignore them? Do you just leave them and get on with your own work? What kind of behavior does it entail to critique? How much attention do you give? Does it matter if you give them attention because in a sense you're perhaps drawing attention to things that perhaps would have got ignored otherwise? I don't have the answer to that, but again, it's a kind of thinking about the ethics of critique and who you critique and why. Third example is a slightly similar case, but with different implications that, again, I won't name the person, but there is someone who pushes and writes about Bourdieu and has invented a whole new category of capitals and has written things which, from a scholarly perspective, just don't make sense. And it's got some traction in the field, and some people are noticing it or allowing it to be published. And again, my feelings are, do I respond to it? Do I spend time writing an article refuting it? Do I ignore it and just let the whole process unfold? What do you do when you find that there's been poor scholarship or scholarship you disagree with in the field? So those, I'm not saying this frames the whole talk, but it does come back to what I want to talk to at the end, which is about ethics. So that's just a sort of anecdote and forewarning. And it comes to be summarized, I suppose, in Schulman's statement, which says the core values of professional communities revolve around the expectation that we do not keep secrets, whether of discovery or of grounded doubt. And of course, I'm referring here to the grounded doubt. What do we do when we have ideas or publications that affect the ideational domain where we find it problematic? Do we keep it to ourselves? Do we make it public? And so on. So again, that's something that we need to think about when we're thinking about book reviews. The problem with book reviews generally is within academia more broadly, they're often considered to be pretty marginal activity. They're not really appreciated, described as being a kind of luxury, an indulgence, a waste of time, a distraction. Within the kind of metric obsessed world of academia, they don't count for anything. They don't do the individual any good in that kind of metricized, ambitious way or entrepreneurial way that academics are complicit in at times or forced to participate in. So book reviews are kind of a genre that's not in all disciplines by any means, but not considered to be of great importance. And often you can see in different journals, it will often be PhD students that write book reviews, and the kind of the luminaries and the noblesses of the kind of disciplines very rarely do it. And if they do it for a specific reason. So we're dealing with a kind of hard sell with you here, because in a sense, book reviews don't carry a lot of kind of cultural capital with doing them. And this is not really helped, as I'll talk about later. The kind of typical genre of book reviews is pretty dull. So I looked in the latest edition of Jeep, and I read the 4 most recent book reviews, and they're absolutely fine. They provide contextualization of the book in a broader field. They provide detailed chapter descriptions, and then surprise, surprise, there is a kind of minor critique followed by an endorsement. And this is a typical pattern. They are formulaic, really quite boring, but they provide the kind of reader's expectations of, is it worth reading or buying, and what's in it? But beyond that, there's very little to commend these particular reviews. I'm not picking on these reviewers at all. You'll find this pretty much throughout Jeep, with the occasional exception. So really, they're quite dull to write as well. They're not only quite dull to read, but they're not particularly engaging of much creativity. But we can think about, possibly for the moment as a kind of interlude, we can think of book reviews as potentially being community building. And again, to counteract that kind of low status low reward notion that academia often carries for book reviews, we can see it as a space that we use to put a notion of collective knowledge ahead of the pressures for individual contributions, which is a nice way of putting it. Unfortunately, ironically at least, in some disciplines, book reviews are the least read section of journals. So you've got the kind of paradox where book reviews are a kind of offering to the community to evaluate a book and to suggest whether it's worth reading, and yet often it's not read. In some journals, the typeface of book reviews is smaller, so it's kind of squashed in at the back as almost like an afterthought. So I'm not doing a very good sell of doing book reviews at the moment, but this is to kind of put it into context, I think, a little bit when we're thinking about perhaps ourselves as practitioners who should be unencumbered to a large degree with the kind of exigencies of ref and perhaps a more entrepreneurial type of existence. If we're not subject to those kind of parameters or pressures, then we ought to be able to write and contribute book reviews in different ways for different reasons. So thinking about that a little bit and thinking about what kind of metaphors we could have for book reviewing, it's a question of how do we greet or welcome and respond to new ideas to our field. And this is interesting when we will look at some examples of book reviews. Do we greet them with a sense of hospitality and this notion of friendship, which Derrida writes about? And if we look through different types of book reviews, what kind of metaphors would be able to frame those kinds of reviews which give an ethical cue about what's operating within reviewing books? So I think it's quite interesting to think about the metaphor of how you receive new knowledge or new publications within the field. So I'm going to start off with some positive ones. And I picked out three. The first one is thanks to Letitia, I think, that sent me this, which is Lemke's review of Hassan's semantic variation, meaning in society and sociolinguistics. This is such a weird review because it's an extended engagement with Hassan's work without really mentioning the book. So it's a deep dive into her work and engagement with the ideas in it and the theories, and a real reflection on her work. But it doesn't really follow the kind of conventions that you see in Duke around a book review, but it's a fascinating way of writing about someone else's work in a form of a book review. The second one is one that I found because I've read Colonialism, Modern Social Theory. And in this review, it's a very, very extensive engagement with the book and almost pedagogic. It explains a lot of concepts. It extends way beyond just a simple summary of the book. But it's clearly a review that took a lot of care and attention in a close reading of the text in order to be able to present it in a way which does have criticisms, but is largely an exploration of the book in a similar way to the review of Hassan's work. And the last one is going to embarrass Rob. In The Language Scholar, I thought that he wrote a very reflective, thoughtful, and detailed account of pedagogies in English for academic purposes. Not only do you have a sense of what's in the book, you get a strong sense of an engagement with the book from the reviewer's perspective. And also you do have two quite poignant or significant critiques at the end. So it's not how can you put it? It's not sycophantic in any way. It's very much a very close engagement with the book and able, because of that engagement, to make telling critiques. So those three, I would say, correspond more with this notion of hospitality or friendship or openness, an invitation to be generous with the authors of the book. This is not always the case, but these three would be kind of models of what I would consider to be generous reviewing. And a whole other genre of criticism of book reviews revealed in how Borgia's work was received in the Anglophone world, where so many things get lost in translation around academic style and expectations and translation. You get these kind of bombastic comments from Jenkins, which is kind of funny, but not exactly constructive. So what is really being communicated, this is referring to Borgia, is a great man's distinction. It's a bit like an intellectual penis sheath. It makes a point, but only concealing the true dimensions of its contents. So obviously thinks this is very clever. Luntly, the language of the book, this is reviewing another book by Borgia, contains some of the worst excesses of academic speak, which continually prompt the desire to put the book down and turn to something more profitable. And going back to Jenkins, it's written in the language so obscurantist, so dense and so ugly that the efforts of reading the damn thing will probably, for most readers, heavily outweigh any benefit. So you've got three comments on Borgia's work, which essentially come down to style. So there's an aesthetic judgment that often takes place within book reviews about things like clarity, that kind of thing, eloquent. You see all those kind of adjectives as well. The problem is that one, these two writers have little understanding or appreciation of the intellectual and cultural context in which Borgia was writing, why he wrote like that, what his rhetorical purposes were, who he's writing for. And as they get abstracted out from a French context in the 60s, 70s, and 80s into Anglophone sociology departments, it doesn't take much for, how can I put it, slightly aggressive British sociologists to find fault with this kind of writing. But it shows a real lack of understanding of the context in which he wrote. It also, unfortunately, if you do read Borgia, it does take a while to understand the stylistic kind of tics that you might have, but it's actually quite easy to read. So even these statements are not even particularly true. But here we get sort of very dismissive, very condescending kind of reviews. Another example is quite funny. This is where there is a kind of fight for symbolic capital within a field, which are called willy waving, which is probably not very appropriate, but it is kind of that between Pennycook and Bloch. So Bloch wrote a book and Pennycook reviewed it. And it's a really, really clever piece of rhetoric from Pennycook, because what in his review, he says, one of the problems with pointing to what is not in applied linguistics is the book is centrally about absence, a rather remorseless critique of deficiency. So what Pennycook does is explicitly and reflexively does what Bloch has done to applied linguistics in a book. He critiques the absences and deficiencies in Bloch's book. So in other words, he does to Bloch what he accuses Bloch of doing in his book. So it's an example of imminent critique. It's book review. Pennycook gives Bloch a lesson in rhetoric and erudition, pointing out partial understandings. For example, Bloch appears to be unaware of Borgia's notion of practice. There's plenty of examples. And also in a rather personal way, signaling a sort of narcissism in Bloch, where he says, so after a nod to the work of Ramanathan and Norton, he reviews some of his own work as the best that could be found. This was both unconvincing and uncomfortable. Now, it's interesting because book reviews, as I said, don't carry great kind of cultural capital in the field, but there are occasions where those with huge symbolic capital, and both of them do, kind of almost deign to give another book their attention. So the question is, would Pennycook have bothered with the review if the author was unknown, or if the author had been more aligned with Pennycook's variation of postmodernism or posthumanism? So Block is essentially a potential rival for Pennycook in a particular section of the field in terms of symbolic capital, who talks about politics, who has the right to define the field. So you can often find that very eminent figures within applied linguistics will produce a book review if they feel that a book is a threat or worthy of their attention, but otherwise they won't bother. So it becomes a kind of book reviewing in this sense, reading it becomes sort of an observer in the way that you might watch a soap opera. You're watching something unfold of kind of high drama and high rhetoric, where various battles are fought. My last example is probably the worst one, which is a kind of very uncivil war that took place over a long period of time between Woodison and various protagonists of critical discourse analysis. I mean, this involved so many different people at different times, principally Woodison at the center of it. And if you look back at all of the extended responses to book reviews, to review articles, to things that Woodison's written, it's generated so much blood, I suppose is the right word, and certainly no love. And de Beauregard was at the center of this and one of the most emotive characters who, often on behalf of others, apparently defended CDA against Woodison's attacks. So this is de Beauregard talking about Woodison. The preface demurely trivializes his verbal sallies of aggression, which he prefers to call reservations and the like. No offence is intended, and I hope to be forgiven if any is taken. Yet much of it is hard for me to see as inoffensive, and the colleagues he attacks and I have corresponded with did not sound exactly forgiving. And he goes on to say that most of the comments that he did receive were unprintable, so giving the impression of a lot of pathos, a lot of emotional and personal kind of vitriol involved in this dispute, all from a book review. So, in terms of what we're thinking about as practitioners who don't have any symbolic capital to kind of do this willy waving and kind of very personalized attacks. So, do we have to play these kind of games if we do book reviews? Do we have to produce book reviews which are formulaic and dull? Or do we have to get into these kind of symbolic fights? Would we be allowed to? Would journals take us seriously if we tried to produce book reviews that were polemical or critical? In any case, why would we want to do that? If we want to distinguish ourselves as a field and as a coherent group of people within the field of EAP, we don't have to emulate any of that. We don't have to be part of that. But before I talk about possibilities, I'm going to be a little bit provocative first. And the problems of practitioners entering the world of book reviewing and scholarship more generally. So the basis of any scholarship is reading both widely and deeply. And I ask the question, do we read enough? And this is not addressed to the people in the room, but really more broadly within the field of EAP. My observations are that this is not the case, or it's not the case amongst some of colleagues that I've come across that appear to regard reading as deeply suspicious, which is a very odd perspective to take when you work in higher education. There can be, and I think this is related to the second point, EAP in the practitioner field can feel deeply parochial. It can feel very prosaic, very pragmatically orientated, and frankly, anti-intellectual. The hostility to theory is ever present, not amongst all practitioners, but certainly in my experience and the experiences that other colleagues and other institutions have given to me, that there is still this sense of not having a role in scholarship and it being a bit above us or beyond us, or and the kind of anti-intellectual comments are often prevalent in the field as well. So we suffer, I think, from needing to change our attitudes to reading in particular and to read more. And we also shouldn't be afraid of having intellectual or theoretical or conceptual ambitions. We're certainly not hostile to theory. A third problem arises because of the performativity and rewards of writing. There are so many publications now, and to be honest, they don't always have a great deal of value. So the production of work within EAP has multiplied, and you'll know from, if you're on any social media platform, the kind of cliched message of I'm so excited to announce I've published X, and the publication is celebrated, but not the content. So it's the performance of having said I've written a book, I've written an article, that seems to prevail over things like reading, which have no capital in higher education whatsoever. You don't get anything for reading in a very direct manner, but you do for writing. This often has perverse effects where I think as practitioners move to scholarship, there can be a sense of a kind of rush to write before having read sufficiently deeply and widely. So that can have the impact of going public in a premature manner where the author is perhaps unaware of the limitations of their work because they simply haven't read widely enough. So we should also go back to the first point of thinking of reading as being fundamental and should have a much bigger place in our work, particularly as a precursor to going public with ideas. Researchers do not always or often understand or care about practice, and this doesn't always matter. But when you read most of JEEP and quite a few publications, I think it's a fair question to ask oneself is how, as practitioners, we can make use of this work. Some of it may be tangential. I make quite a lot of use of Bourdieu, but it doesn't appear in my classroom particularly. So I'm not saying any kind of almost like anti-intellectual link, how useful is something in a very direct manner. But we can make use of research and researchers, but we should also be calling out researchers who offer us advice about pedagogy or practices which are not based in any form of either empathy or experience. So that goes to the question of within the field of EAP, how do we answer or push back? How do we hold ourselves and others accountable for what goes in the public domain? How do we assert a culture of reading? And what would an ethics of practitioner reviewing look like? These are kind of key questions, I think, as we think about why do a book review? What would be the point of doing it? And I think we should be holding published authors to account for their work within EAP if it's claiming to have some kind of impact on the work that we do. Anyway, those are just some rather grim provocations to think about. So in terms of actual suggestions, before I move on to the last bit of ethics, I'm thinking about book reviewing as being a kind of low status genre in that sense, because it's low status, it doesn't really matter what we do with it. We should be able to explore and be creative with it without fear of jeopardy in any kind of way. So some examples here that might be of interest to people is more an extended essay review on a cluster of books around a particular theme. Often in history, for example, you get 3 or 4 publications around the same kind of historical event or approach, and that allows a kind of extended discussion of the books and a kind of much deeper reflection on the themes and comparing. So it will be interesting within EAP to take, I don't know, 2 or 3 books that cover a particular aspect of academic writing, for example, and use that as a springboard for a much more extended, longer essay on that, using the books as kind of stimulus. Joint reviewing is fairly rare, although we see it a little bit more often. Reviewing tends to be single authored, but there's no reason why that can't be done collegially or collaboratively. Another particular way of approaching reviewing is to have multiple authors that have different expertise or in slightly different fields reviewing a particular book. So there are different disciplinary or subfield perspectives on a book. We could review articles, not just books. A close reading of an article is also very valuable and something that doesn't really happen very often. We don't just have to review new books. We could also revisit influential texts, forgotten texts. We often are stuck in a kind of amnesia where cyclically things come back. Maybe even within social justice, some of the things that we're seeing now were prevalent when I was at university a long time ago. So often we kind of forget history and forget texts that may actually be more powerful if we took them seriously. And also, it'll be interesting to look at texts written in other languages. Again, to kind of deparochialize what kind of influences we could be drawing on that are important in other languages and other contexts. We could also be thinking about how we might engage with the author in the review, because obviously the author is extracted from that for various ethical reasons, but I see no reason why there couldn't be some kind of dialogue with the author where there is a kind of summative evaluation with some kind of questions for the author, which may be for clarification before critique, in other words, before jumping in with perhaps some comments, or it could also be an opportunity for the author to kind of concede or to expand or whatever, but certainly as a kind of more than a right to respond. So those are just some examples. I mean, there are multiple others, but if you think of a book review as simply being contextualization, chapter summaries with a few comments, and then a sort of endorsement with 1 or 2 minor quibbles, it doesn't have to be like that. To finish off, I want to kind of go back to, I don't want to talk about the anecdotes, but I kind of want to just mention the ethics of reviewing. So reviewing itself requires a very close reading of text. And it also requires a degree of judgment and evaluation. So that suggests a kind of duty or responsibility we have in reviewing. It suggests being as fair as you can to the authors, to present them in the best possible light, I think, in order to make sure that you're not operating with a kind of ad hominem or a straw man kind of argument. That you're generous in ambiguities, but also you can point out mistakes and faults. It's not that that's the issue. And also to remember that your reviews offer a reflection of you and your own values. So I don't think Widdowson has got a great deal to be proud of in his role in the CDA disputes. I think Pennycook can be quite proud of his rhetorical demolition of a rival, but to be honest, it doesn't really show him in a particularly good light either, in certain regards. But it does leave open the question then, going back to Schulman, about if you do have doubts about an influence in the ideational domain, we shouldn't say silent about it. So that brings us to the question then ethically. Whoops, sorry. I'm trying to get rid of something on my screen. There we go. So which books would we want to choose? Those that we endorse, those that we want others to read, we think they contribute something. That's obviously an important aspect of making more visible work that we think is worth reading. Those that are a threat in some way, I think that's important too. Those that we think might damage our profession or an aspect of our work, if we object to in some way. One of the problems, of course, is that powerful doxers within EAP often go unwritten because those that hold the power don't feel the need to necessarily have to explain themselves through publications. But there are different views on EAP, and there are different ways in which they can impact the practice of EAP and practitioners. So we should also think about reviewing books that we feel are problematic for the kind of work that we do. Those that intrigue, and I'm going to give an example of that in a bit. I think those that are beyond EAP but could inform EAP are important. So not looking just within EAP, but looking more broadly. In my case, I'm interested in social theory, but it might come from linguistics, could be from psychology. It doesn't really matter. But if there is some impact on EAP, I think it's worth thinking about. We also need to think about why are some books ignored or why are some worth ignoring. So not all books are worth reviewing. And again, the judgment of that is very hard to make, but perhaps some books are worth just forgetting. Who knows? And I'm going to give some examples of some problem reviewing that would be quite interesting. I think Julia is in the room, and Julia Molinari wrote What Makes Writing Academic. Now, I would suggest that everyone review this book, and that's not necessarily an endorsement of it, but I think she does something more important in that book. It's a catalyst for thinking quite hard about your own views around academic writing. It's a provocation of a sort, and maybe not intended, but I've found this book very interesting as a way of trying to work out my own prejudices, my own commitments through reading the book. So in a way, the book is more useful than a simple endorsement. It's forced me to think harder about what I think about the arguments she's put forward, where my own lacuna is, where my own lapses are, where my own prejudice lie. So a review of this book is cathartic in the sense that it forces you to think deeply. You may not like it, you may find it, people have occasionally said it's very theoretical as a kind of almost as a criticism, but then that makes you think about, well, why do you think something is too theoretical? Why is that something negative? So I'd really encourage you to review Julia's book for clarifying your own thoughts on these things. Another example, perhaps, of where an article review would be very useful. You may have come across Academic Publishing and the Myth of Linguistic Injustice. This is Hyland's rather gruff attempt to basically say that L2 writers have no special disadvantages in publishing. He does it in a very unsophisticated way, but he does make some good points. But that has generated a kind of series of responses. But those kind of articles are worth reviewing because you have to go into quite a lot of detail about how closely you read it, how you extract the arguments from that, and how you respond to it. So I'd recommend those kinds of publications. The last one amused me because this has sort of come up recently in a discussion. I don't know if you've read Incidents in an Educational Life, the Swales kind of memoir of his life, but it was fairly recently reviewed in ELTJ, along with David Crystal's memoir. Now, the reason why they might be quite interesting to review is more from the perspective of oops, sorry, I've gone one too far. There we go. Is that you've got two very large luminaries of the field who, for some reason, perhaps good reason, think that we would be interested in their lives as such. And that's fair enough. That it's up to each reader to decide that. But it's a very, very peculiar way of representing the field. And it's some work that I've been doing with, with Letitia, where we've been looking at the kind of colonialism and the past luminaries of the field. So this is just an extract from the review of these two books. So both memoirs also exemplify many of the themes, blah, 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 in which he points out the significance of two key factors in facilitating the development of innate talent. Okay, so both of them have got innate talent, opportunity and practice. In both memoirs, protagonists are fortunate enough to have been provided with opportunities from which they could profit, but only by making the best of these opportunities. If you're a sociologist and you're looking at field analysis, there's a lot to say. If you have any interest in critical discourse analysis and the kind of Anglocentric and imperial origins of EAP, this is just there's so much you could say about it. So again, a very critical, different kind of history can emerge in EAP when it's juxtaposed against reading this kind of thing. So again, a review of that would be interesting. Lastly, and then I'll shut up, is you may have come across the bibliometric study of EAP research, again, another Highland thing, who is doing what, where, and when. And we get this issue of the most cited authors. And I did a search on Bourdieu within EAP, and I looked witin Jeep. And although he is cited, most of it is perfunctory citations that will be capital in brackets, Bourdieu, and then it goes on to other things. So it made me think about how to critically review an article like this, where there is a misrepresentation of influence through citation. And there's a whole plethora of bibliometric studies now. He's launched a mini industry in these things, but the kind of things that they claim to be the claims that are making aren't really very valuable, and they underpin a kind of very surface level understanding of influence. So again, another article that's kind of ripe for not just a review, but a kind of meditation on citations and so on. So I'm going to stop there, but those are the kinds of thoughts that come to mind around book reviewing. I'm going back to the anecdotes. The ethics of reviewing are really complex, of what you choose to write about, how you choose to write about it, what kind of authors are you choosing for what purposes, and so on. But I do think within the practitioner field, we can revitalize the whole book review genre. It doesn't have to be this kind of basically shopping list formulaic kind of writing. We can make it much more interesting. So that's it. I'm going to stop sharing the screen.